For quite some time now, every day for Lester Torres started out the same way. After drinking coffee and having a hasty breakfast, he hurried to the hospital, where his little daughter Mary was. Lester didn't know what he was being punished for, but deep down he believed that sooner or later everything would change for the better. The fact was that 3 years ago, his wife Gloria died in childbirth. That terrible day was forever engraved in Lester's memory. Since Gloria's contractions started at home, Lester personally took his wife to the hospital. Gloria felt good throughout the pregnancy, and there was no sign of trouble. At that moment, Lester had no doubt that everything would go well. But when he received a call from the hospital and was asked to come in, the man immediately felt that something was wrong. Of course, Lester couldn't have been prepared for what the on-call nurse told him. "Mr. Torres, sir, we have bad news. Your wife died of massive internal bleeding. The doctors did everything they could, but even they are powerless sometimes." Lester didn't hear the nurse's last words because his whole being was literally torn from unbearable pain. The inconsolable widower felt like he was stuck in a bad dream and that everything would return to normal as soon as he woke up. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Lester went through the funeral and the wake in some kind of haze. The worst part was that there was no one to help the man. Unfortunately, he was raised at an orphanage, and late Gloria's parents lived on the other side of the country. But what could anyone have really done to help in this situation? If Lester didn't have to take care of his little daughter, he would have probably completely lost his mind. But he did have Mary, so he had to pull himself together and take care of her, especially since he had to take on the roles of both her father and her mother from then on. Of course, not a day went by that Lester didn't think about his late wife and cried quietly, looking at pictures of her. 3 years flew by, but they all seemed exactly the same to Lester. The young father had to deal with a lot of problems, so he didn't really have time to grieve. Raising his daughter alone wasn't an easy task, and Lester got to feel all the hardships that single parenthood entailed. It's hard to even imagine what the young father had to go through before he came to terms with the death of his wife and could devote himself entirely to raising his daughter. But Lester couldn't have known what fate had in store for him. He got the horrifying news 6 months ago during the routine medical checkup. Mary was diagnosed with a terrible disease. At first, Lester simply refused to listen to the doctors and truly believed that Mary was misdiagnosed. Why is this happening to me? Lester kept asking himself. At the same time, he understood perfectly well that no amount of lamenting was going to help the situation. Lester would have gladly sacrificed his own life if only it would help his daughter be healthy again. Mary had been going to the hospital's pediatric oncology department for 3 weeks now. He came to see his daughter every day, and every time he seemed to be reborn from the ashes like a mythical sphinx. He truly believed that kiddos deserve to be happy and healthy and live their lives without pain. Every time he stepped into the hospital, Lester made sure to have a positive attitude and even managed to smile through the pain. Least of all, he wanted his daughter to see his fear and desperation. It's hard to say whether Mary realized what her father was actually feeling, but every time he entered her room, she smiled at him. All this time, Lester was patiently waiting for his daughter to finally call him Dad. Unfortunately, the rapidly developing disease caused Mary to have a developmental delay, which in turn caused problems with her speech. For this reason, Lester's conversation with his daughter were essentially monologues on his part. The man told his daughter about everything that had happened to him during the day. She listened attentively to her father and simply nodded from time to time. At moments like these, Lester felt that everything was fine with Mary and that she ended up at the hospital by some kind of mistake. But when the nurse would come into the room with a tray of medicines, the man had no choice but to return to reality. Of course, the nurse never rushed the young father and patiently waited for him to leave on his own. Lester understood everything without words and couldn't help but cry every time he left his daughter's room. He usually did it on a bench behind the hospital building. No one could see him there, so Lester allowed himself to feel all the emotions he was trying to keep in check in front of his daughter. That day was also no exception. But when Lester approached his favorite bench, he saw that a large dog was sitting next to it. It looked somewhat like a Labrador. Lester froze in surprise and looked at the unexpected guest. "Hey, what are you doing here?" the man asked cautiously. Of course, Lester didn't get an answer to his question for one simple reason. The dog couldn't speak. However, he did get an answer from someone else. It was an orderly who went out into the backyard to get some fresh air. "This is Rudy, sir. His owner died a week ago. The dog hasn't left his post since. He's probably waiting for her," the medical worker explained. Lester looked at the dog with genuine interest. The animal seemed rather friendly. "So what, he just sits here and doesn't leave?" Lester asked, still unable to believe what he was being told. "Yes, sir, he just sits here. I bring him food whenever I can, but he doesn't eat much and always looks very sad," the man explained. "What about the relatives of the deceased? Can't they take the dog?" Lester asked. The elderly thought for a bit, wrinkling his forehead. Finally, he pulled himself together and said his owner's name was Amanda Wood. In all the time she spent at the hospital, only a little boy of about 6 years old came to visit her a couple of times. There was no one else. At the mention of a child, Lester's heart sank. The man's memory immediately jumped to the day when he lost his wife and Mary lost her mother. Meanwhile, Rudy got up and licked Lester's hand, wagging his tail. "Oh, it looks like he likes you. Rudy can read people very well. I already noticed it. By the way, my name is Simon," the orderly said with a smile. Lester nodded and patted Rudy's head. The man was impressed by the story of the dog's boundless devotion. He'd heard stories about pets who stayed loyal to their owners even after they died, but he never saw anything like that in real life. Having said goodbye to Simon and Rudy, Lester went home. The man worked as a programmer for one of the companies in the city, and given the man's situation, his employer allowed him to work from home. The truth was that all of Lester's days felt hopelessly identical to the man. Every morning he went to visit his daughter at the hospital, then he worked during the day, and then he allowed himself to feel sad in the evenings. Lester didn't sleep well and kept waking up for unknown reasons. There was a rumor going around that Dr. Donald Gray was coming to his daughter's hospital. He specialized in Mary's disease. Lester couldn't miss out on such an opportunity. Coming to the hospital every day, the man kept asking the receptionist the same question. "Has Mr. Gray arrived at the hospital yet?" But he got the same answer every day, which only upset the young father even more. Nothing changed that day. Having asked the on-call nurse about Dr. Gray, he got a negative answer, as always. But when the desperate father went into his daughter's room, he shuddered in amazement. A boy of about 6 years was sitting by Mary's bed and telling her something, gesticulating wildly. A young nurse stood a couple of steps away from them. Apparently, she was the one who brought the boy into Mary's room. Seeing Lester, the nurse blushed deeply. Still unable to understand what was going on, Lester looked questioningly at the nurse. "I'm sorry, sir. I was the one who brought Liam to see Mary. You must have heard that his mother died a week ago. I thought that the kids would have something to talk about," the young woman said quietly. Seeing the joyful face of his daughter, Lester realized that the nurse did the right thing. "Thank you. If it weren't for you," the man began, but the nurse put her index finger to her lips, trying to stop the man from interrupting the conversation between the two kiddos. Although it was difficult to call it a conversation since only Liam spoke, Mary listened attentively and smiled. As it turned out, the new nurse's name was Abigail. The young man had been working at the hospital for 2 months, but Lester hadn't seen her before because he mostly worked in a different building. Abigail knew late Amanda Wood and tried to take care of her son. "What about Liam's father?" Lester asked cautiously. Abigail spread her hands in response to his question, making it clear that the boy didn't know his father. Lester decided not to pry because he knew that all kinds of things could happen in life and that not all parents loved their children the way he loved Mary. And yet, Abigail told him one very important piece of news. "You know what? I was at the doctor's lounge today and I heard them talking about Donald Gray. Apparently, he's coming to our hospital soon and he's going to examine your daughter," Abigail said. At that moment, Lester would have gladly picked up Abigail and twirled her around the room. "Finally, thank you, Lord," Lester whispered and headed for the exit. Rudy the dog was already waiting for the man out on the street. The animal ran up to greet him as if they were old friends. "I guess we're friends now, aren't we?" Lester said with a smile and patted the dog. At that moment, Simon came from around the corner of the building with a small bowl in his hand, which apparently had dog food in it. Having greeted Lester, the orderly complained that Rudy refused to eat. "I don't know what to do. Maybe you could help somehow? He seems to like you," Simon asked hopefully. Lester felt a bit uncomfortable, but he didn't refuse to help. In the depths of his soul, he was sincerely sorry for the dog, who believed that his owner was still alive. Having taken the bowl from the orderly's hands, the young father placed it in front of the dog. Stroking Rudy's head, Lester began to coax him like a small child. The dog seemed to listen to the man, after which he wagged his tail and carefully bowed his muzzle to the bowl. Of course, Rudy didn't have much of an appetite, but he still ate half of the food the orderly brought out to him. It was definitely progress, which made Simon look at Lester gratefully. "You're a wizard," the orderly exclaimed admiringly. The young father smiled and waved his hand. Few people knew that Lester dreamed of having a dog as a child. But since kiddos at the orphanage couldn't have pets, his dream wasn't meant to come true. At that moment, Abigail and Liam came out of the building. Seeing Lester, the nurse smiled happily. As Abigail got closer, she asked the man for a favor. "Excuse me, sir, could you take Liam home? I would love to do it myself, but I can't leave work yet. It's not far from here, but I still don't want him to walk on his own," the woman explained. Of course, Liam agreed to help. He took Liam by the hand and led him down the street. To the great joy of the orderly, Rudy immediately followed them. He recognized his little owner and decided to go home with him. Liam turned out to be a smart and bright boy. During their conversation, the boy told Lester that his dad died in an accident when he was 2 years old. "My mother raised me on her own since then, and 2 years ago she brought Rudy into the house. She found him sitting by the trash cans and whining quietly when he was a little puppy. So she took him home," Liam explained. "Your mother is a good woman. I'm sure that you could be proud of her," Lester said, patting the boy on the shoulder. Liam lived in an old house half a mile away from the hospital. It was a rather bad neighborhood where one could easily get into trouble. Only then did it become clear to Lester that having a dog in such a place wasn't a luxury, but a necessary precaution. Chatting with Liam made Lester feel much better. It seemed that this boy knew how to heal souls and did it better than any adult ever could. Unbeknownst to himself, Lester felt sympathy for this kid, who was now an orphan just like him. The man understood that Liam was probably going to end up in an orphanage. He knew all too well that life there was very hard. Having said goodbye to the boy, Lester leaned over to Rudy and said softly, "Be a good boy, buddy. Now you have someone to take care of. Don't let me down. I'm counting on you here." Lester knew from the dog's eyes that he understood every word. Rudy wagged his tail as if to confirm and escorted the guest to the gate. Lester was in a great mood. The news of the upcoming visit of Donald Gray filled the man's heart with hope, which he had almost lost before. Lester was also quite smitten by Nurse Abigail, who was taking care of her late friend's son. Of course, it wasn't love at first sight, but Lester did feel an inexplicable sympathy for the young, kind woman. He spent the rest of the day in anxious anticipation. Lester could only think about one thing. When will the doctor from New York arrive? However, when the young father came to the hospital the next day and saw the joyful faces of the nurses, he immediately realized that his dream had come true. Mary's room was full of people. A gray-haired man in his 60s examined the little patient and personally made recommendations to the attendants. From the way Donald Gray conducted the exam, Lester immediately realized that there was a good reason why he was considered one of the best specialists in his field. After the rounds, the doctor approached Lester and hurried to assure the young father that his daughter would be fine. "It actually isn't as bad as it would seem at first glance. You got her at the hospital in time. I think I can help Mary," Dr. Gray said. Lester was ready to give anything in the world only to save his daughter. Still afraid to believe in his own luck, the man followed the doctor with his eyes and then headed for the exit. Abigail caught up with him when he was already at the very door. The nurse's eyes made it clear that she wanted to tell Lester something. "I need to talk to you about Liam. I want to get custody of him, but in order to do this, I need..." The woman started hesitating. "You need what?" Lester asked cautiously. Abigail blushed deeply and then said, "I need a husband. they would only let him get adopted by a full family, Abigail explained quickly. Only then did Lester realize why she was feeling so uncomfortable. He knew that adopting a child wasn't an easy undertaking and that it required a lot of time to fill in all kinds of paperwork and provide all kinds of information. The young nurse's proposal seemed a bit strange, but Lester understood why she was doing it. Moreover, it would be a fake marriage, and he wouldn't be obliged to actually do anything. Being a responsible and kind man, Lester agreed to help. Meanwhile, Donald Gray started treating his daughter, Mary. To Lester's great relief, Mary didn't need to get surgery and could be treated with the right combination of medicines. Visiting his daughter every day, Lester saw that she was clearly getting better. Mary used to look pale and sickly, but now her cheeks burned with blush and her eyes shone with happiness. This must have been the miracle that Lester was praying to God for all this time. Of course, it was all thanks to Donald Gray, who turned out to be a true professional in his field. Complete recovery was still far away, but the first steps had already been taken. Keeping his word to Abigail, Lester agreed to become her fake husband. After they got married, the young people went to social services in order to get custody of little Liam. Fortunately, they didn't face any issues. At the sight of such a beautiful couple, the social workers immediately decided to help Abigail and Lester adopt Liam. It just so happened that Mary got discharged from the hospital that same day that the couple got custody of Liam. So the young parents had two great events to celebrate. At that moment, Lester and Abigail didn't even think about the fact that their marriage was actually fake. Looking at the joyful faces of the children, the young people were glad that everything turned out the way that they'd hoped it would. The most interesting thing was that Abigail and Lester decided not to break up, but start living together as if their marriage was a real one. It's hard to say when the two of them developed feelings for each other. It could have actually happened at any moment from their first meeting. So, all that's left for us to do is to be happy for the family, which had to go through so much before they could finally all be happy.